Hello plant people, how are you guys doing today? If you're new around here, my name's Ashley and I'm a Canadian gardener, and normally on this channel I take science of gardening and I apply it to all things plants, so that's both indoors and out. But today's episode is a special Remembrance Day video. So if you followed this channel long enough, you know I have a respect for our veterans. I've had several family members that have served or did serve in World War II specifically. If you missed the video from last year, it was all about the poppies, and today is the day to check out that video because it is the 100-year anniversary for the poppy. So that is very, very cool. Be sure to check that out. I go through everything as to why poppies are important to veterans and just commemorating our veterans, but also kind of the science behind why these poppies started popping up all across the battlefield. So very interesting stuff. Today's video though, we're going to be getting into victory gardens, and I thought this was a fitting video to do for this year because of the massive resurgence of the word during COVID. It was very common for a lot of people to be talking about victory gardens. So let's jump into exactly what those are from a Canadian perspective. This video is mind-blowing. There's so much research I did on this that I had no idea existed. So some really fun highlights that we're going to get into is how Canadian gardeners were actual badasses back in the day. Secondly, how Canadian gardeners helped formulate the food triangle, the initial Canadian food triangle, and solved malnutrition from coast to coast. Crazy stuff. And thirdly, how Canadian gardeners actually started pointing out major inefficiencies in the farm production in rural Canada. So just a ton of cool topics to talk about. Let's jump straight into it. So victory gardens in Canada were kind of frowned upon by the government and your average person for a huge majority of all of World War I and over half of World War II. And it was to the point that in 1942, the Canadian government actually put out a pamphlet about them because the Americans were putting out victory gardens left, right, and center. And the government was trying to discourage Canadians from doing this because they had some concerns. So let's take a look at what that pamphlet said by quoting it, because I just can't put it any better than what the Canadian government did in this pamphlet here. So in 1942, the Department of Agriculture here in Canada published a pamphlet saying they wanted to discourage unskilled city folk from starting gardens. It would create a demand for equipment such as garden tools, fertilizers, and sprays, which are made of materials needed by Canada's war effort. And because Canada's vegetable seed supply can be employed by experienced gardeners with equipment on hand. That right there is how the Canadian government viewed people starting to garden. They wanted only the best of the best to have their hands on the seeds because they already had all the equipment they needed. Now, I asked my grandma, and I ask my grandma this all the time, what is one thing you remember about World War II? Because she was a little girl when World War II was happening. And one thing she avidly remembers was she was unable to get rubber boots. She remembers as a little girl asking her parents for rubber boots and there being none on the shelves because all the rubber was being used in the war effort to make things like tires. So you can imagine if a small child is unable to get the rubber boots that they need to go hang out in the field and garden with their mother, I mean, getting tools to start a garden, that's going to be in high demand, that's going to be expensive, and the Canadian government is going to want to reroute all that wood and all that metal elsewhere. However, in 1943, the Canadian government suddenly changed its tone. And there's two factors that came into why the Canadian government decided to change its tone. The first one being is the seed supply started increasing. So while there was gardeners who were experienced gardening and there was producers, farmers producing food, not all of it could be transported quick enough across the country, meaning most of it had to be turned into viable seed that could be used the next year. Keep in mind, the railways were completely saturated with the movement of military equipment to the front lines. So that means there's not enough room for food, and it's just a locally grown food supply that's supplying the community around it. So there was a lot of excess seed on hand. That is the first reason. The second reason is probably the coolest reason why the Canadian government decided to allow Victory Gardens to begin happening, and that's because Canadian gardeners, the experienced ones, started to protest. Yes, Canadian gardeners coast to coast started staging massive protests, asking the government to allow them to teach inexperienced gardeners or gardeners who want to just give this a shot how to grow food. And the government heard the cry of the people and decided to allow for Victory Gardens, to the point that in 1943 they started releasing pamphlets to the Canadian public telling them everything they needed to know about gardening. I would love to get my hands on one of the original prints, or just even the print in general that I could print off in PDF form. I think that'd be so cool. Apparently it included everything from what crops to grow, when to plant them in the ground, how to water them, fertilize them, prepare the soil, harvest, you name it. I would just love to see the old school knowledge and what was put into that pamphlet. I think that'd be so cool. So the Victory Garden was a huge success in Canada. So the Canadian government noticed that there was such an increase in interest in the actual Victory Garden concept that they actually began to do surveys on the demographic involved with the Victory Gardens, and they found out some really cool results. They noticed that there was a new demographic involved in gardening. Typically, prior to 1943, in Canada in particular, gardening was more of a woman's work. After 1943, however, it included men and children as well. Now, the thought process behind why this is because it was viewed as a way to show patriotism and support for the troops overseas. That's why nearly everyone got involved, because everyone wanted to show the support for the men and women that were sacrificing their lives. Arguably one of the most ironic stat out of all of this was how much those uneducated city folk produced. And this is gonna blow your guys' mind. So it was discovered that 82% of all the produce eaten by Canadians in that time frame was produced on a city lot. That means either a front yard, a backyard, an empty vacant lot, or a community garden. They even went so far to break that down to discover that 15% of all the community gardens were actually done on vacant lots next to homes, and 3% was only done in community gardens set up by the city. That means the entire remainder of the 82% of all produce produced that Canadians ate was done in the front or back lawn of the people's houses, which is just insane. But there was an effect on Canadian society that the Canadian government didn't realize was going to happen when they even brought up the concept of Victory Gardening, and that is camaraderie. So they soon realized that the citygoers were having a better understanding of what it took to be a farmer, and the farmers were becoming more impressed with what the citygoers were able to do with their land. And this caused a bridge to be formed between the rural communities of Canada and the urban cities of Canada. So the urban growers started to realize how much work it took to actually produce food, and ended up finding a newfound respect for the farmers in rural areas. Simultaneously, the rural farmers were able to understand how effective land could be when it was maintained a certain way, and the citygoers were able to show that, and so a newfound respect was found by the farmers themselves. I mean, that in and of itself is most definitely what we need today. Interesting stuff that's starting to come out in the news I think it was like last year I found an article about it, was food forests. And so this is where First Nations came in. Food forests, if you did not know, were kind of a First Nations invention. And there are some that are hundreds of years old that are still producing today. And these food forests, again, were used during the war effort to supply food. So if you don't know what a food forest is, or what the Aboriginal or the First Nations version of a food forest is here in Canada, specifically more so in BC, it is a grouping of a wide diversity of different fruiting bushes and trees in a localized area, meaning it's kind of like a cultivated land, but not. It's very heterogeneous, lots of biodiversity, but in a single area, meaning the picking and the processing of it isn't as labor intensive as foraging. So it is domesticated in a way that is valuable to the environment around it. So again, gardening brought together Canadians coast to coast, regardless of income, where they were raised, where they were born, where they lived. Everyone came together. End of World War II, the Canadian government was starting to notice that a lot of the recruitments that were happening by the Canadian government and the military weren't passing. So a lot of these guys and women weren't making it through the initial medical check and were actually being denied on the basis of malnutrition. And so they saw this happening early 1940s, and maybe to a point prior to that, and they didn't have a way of solving it, because as far as they were concerned, it was a lack of food, and it was a problem that could not be solved because these city folk wouldn't be able to supply the food. They would, if anything, cause even more malnutrition. But what ended up actually happening is after 1943, as the harvest started coming off, we started noticing that a lot of the recruitments coming through the military were going through, and malnutrition was actually slowly being lifted off of society. And they actually attribute this now to those victory gardens and that fresh source of local food. So Canadian gardeners back in the day with their victory gardens were also helping fight hunger here in Canada. The Canadian government saw this, and they saw the excess of fresh produce, and they suddenly decided it's time to revamp that food pyramid. And now today you see a huge portion of the food pyramid being fresh fruits and vegetables, and you can thank your Canadian gardener for that. So next time you have a picky eater, maybe remind them of the story and how the food pyramid came to be what it is today. I don't even know if it's a pyramid. I think it's like a circle or something, but when I was in school it was still a pyramid. Anyways, the Canadian government realized the value of fruits and vegetables, how it was helping society as a whole, how there was excess produce, and so putting that in the food pyramid wasn't going to do anything bad because people now had access to it. It wasn't going to break the bank for everyone. And so, ta-da, now you have the food pyramid. So there you guys have it. That is the story of the Canadian Victory Garden. How cool is that? Also, be sure to share this video with your loved ones to help them celebrate Remembrance Day and put a little bit of remembrance into their day. We're just kidding. But in all seriousness, next time you're talking about your garden, instead of feeling bad about it, remember, our ancestors, our forefathers of gardening in cold climates, they did the hustle for us, and we need to repay the favor. As well as the next time you drop a zucchini off on someone's front doorstep, or 25 zucchinis on everyone's doorstep, you never know. Maybe you're bridging a gap that never existed before. Gardening can bring people together and almost never can tear anyone apart. So there's never a bad reason to enjoy gardening, to talk about it. And now you have one little tidbit of history when it comes to gardening in Canada. I want to thank you guys so much for watching. Be sure to give this video a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button if you stayed to the end, and I will talk to you guys next time. Bye.